If you find the signature of one of the greatest old masters on a painting, you'd be excused for not looking too hard for any other signatures. But I had been closely studying this painting for over 2.5 years, and I never saw a signature that had been staring me in the face the whole time. But to explain the full significance of this, I first need to take you back to Delft in the early 1650s. And the simplest way I can do that from the other side of the world is via Google Earth. Just starting from the south of the city, the walls of the city would have originally just run around the inside of this canal, and this is where Vermeer's famous view of Delft was painted from. And obviously it was a little boat harbour at that time, full of herring boats and transport boats. But just moving due north towards the centre of the city, we come across the main market square. And the market square in Delft is defined by two large buildings. One is the New Church, Nieuwkerk, at the eastern end, and at the western end is the Town Hall. Now, Vermeer was born just over in the back of this area. The Artists Guild is this building here, and it's been renewed since his time, but a couple of doors along, his father leased a tavern. I think it was known as the Flying Fox, and Vermeer was believed to have been born in that building. When he was about 8 years old, the father's lease on that tavern was not renewed, but he was fortunate to be able to buy a large tavern just on the market square. Now, it no longer exists. It's basically in this little gap here. There used to be a little alley running next to it that goes over a bridge straight into the back of the Artists Guild. But the building itself has now been knocked down. But it was apparently quite a large building, and they were able to buy it, although the family remained heavily indebted forever because of it. When Vermeer was 20, he married Catharina Bollners, who lived just across the square from him, really only about 80 metres away. Her mother was a divorcee, or separated from her husband, and lived in a large house in this area. It was either on this corner here, or it was where this church now stands. She was quite wealthy and just lived with the two daughters in the house on the corner of this little alley, which was called Molenpoort. I think it probably still is there, but it runs between the church and this building. There's some speculation about whether the house was actually where the church is, or whether it was on the other corner. But either way, it looked just across a little path and a canal into the back of these houses just here. This area is also interesting because it was known as the Catholic Hoek, which is the Catholic corner of the town. I'll just go to a 2D image so you can see it a bit better. So the Catholic Hoek was this area around here. Basically, it was a little Catholic enclave. I don't know how far it ran out to the side, but it was certainly defined within this area, and there was a number of small house churches within buildings in this area. There was a Catholic school. The Catholics were allowed to practice their faith even in the Calvinist Netherlands, but they had to do it discreetly. So there obviously was some religious discrimination. Karel Fabritius, who was about 10 years older than Vermeer, painted his famous view of Delft from this corner. Now, I don't know whether it was an imaginary view, but it's quite an amazing 3D-looking image designed to sit on a curved background and be viewed through a peephole. Fabritius, of course, had a terrible ending. He was the man who painted the Goldfinch. He had been, for a couple of years, a student of Rembrandt's in Amsterdam. His studio was out to the north of the town, and he was killed when there was a gunpowder explosion. The town's gunpowder store, in fact, I think it might have been a major store for the Netherlands, exploded early one day, killing at least 100 people and injuring and maiming about 1,000, and obviously deafening a lot of them. And, of course, a lot of the old brick buildings that were in the centre of the town were also damaged. Even the church windows were smashed. Interestingly, some years later, Vermeer painted his little street painting, which shows a house with a damaged gable with two children playing outside. So you have to wonder whether those houses were around at that time and whether or not they actually were some of the houses that were damaged. The other painter, of course, that we're interested in this time is Pieter de Hooch. And Pieter de Hooch seemed to paint around this part of the town. He's been in the back blocks of all of these houses, by the look of it, painting views. People know where it was painted from because even though he seemed to make up a lot of his scenes or parts of them. In some of them, buildings can be recognised, including the church tower, etc. So he was living just down here, and of course he was also a member of the guild, which was right behind Vermeer's childhood home. So Vermeer's whole world was really encompassed within this sort of tiny space of 80 or 90 metres. When Vermeer died, he was buried in the old church, in this church just to the west of the main square. So it was certainly a very confined little world that he lived in, and quite a beautiful little world, but still quite claustrophobic. It's interesting to think that when he came out the front door of the tavern that he lived in, he would have had to crane his neck just to see the top of this tower of this church. Of course, this church would have originally been a Catholic church and was converted to a Protestant church under the Calvinist wave that swept through the Netherlands, as was presumably the old church. That would have also been a Catholic church, and this new Catholic church that's built here now, of course, didn't exist at the time. So what does all this mean for my painting? Well, firstly, before a cataclysmic explosion swept Fabritius away in 1654, he was certainly out and about painting around the city. Fabritius had been outside drawing and perhaps painting only a stone's throw from Vermeer's front door. If Vermeer's earliest paintings were these three, the last being St. Praxedis, painted or perhaps completed in 1655, was there anything that might have caused him to start painting his own city at about that time? Obviously an explosion that kills 100 people, including a famous painter, and injures and maims 1 person in 20 could do it. Artists have always reflected the world around them. The decision to paint a view, in effect a portrait of the city, and a nostalgic scene of 2 children playing in the street in front of a damaged house, could well have been triggered by that horrific event. The signatures on those 2 paintings also seem to fit well as derivatives of his earlier signatures, perhaps placing both paintings closer to the mid-1650s rather than towards the end of that decade, as experts believe. So how does all that relate to my painting? Well, on the 390th anniversary of Vermeer's baptism, I found another signature on my painting. Not long after I first bought it and found the first signature, I was puzzling over whether the painting even looked like a Vermeer. It was dirty and had a dark varnish over it. So I decided that one way I could visualise how it would look if it was cleaned up would be to take a photograph and tweak it in terms of the sharpness and the contrast and the colours. So I did that and had it professionally test printed at a smaller size. The results were terrible. I'd pushed the colours and contrast too much. I put it in a cheap frame and just left it leaning against a wall, pretty much forgotten as a bad joke. At the end of October 2022, I was walking past the photo when for some reason I picked it up and held it up to the light. I was stunned to read the name Meer on the yellow and pink wall that was facing me. The camera had obviously picked up something that I hadn't noticed, and because the print was so disappointing I'd never studied it before. When I looked more closely, I could see that the M was connected to a V, and there was an I with a dot to the left. The signature was the same as the one on Vermeer's Little Street, albeit a bit more fancy. The E's were faint, but surely these marks must be a signature. Just as with those on the floor, they were beyond coincidence. And there were a couple of other features of that signature that a forger might have missed. In the very centre of the M, there's a little diamond shape that's on both the Little Street painting and on my painting. And also, he often painted little round knobs at the end of his letters, which this signature also appears to have. But for me, there was something far more compelling. Vermeer only ever painted one painting where the sunlight hits a surface directly, and that's his view of Delft. On the very right of the painting, around the Rotterdam Gate, where he uses pale yellow and a touch of rose pink. Those are the same colours that the artist who painted my painting has used on the sunlit wall behind the signature. Interestingly, Fabritius used similar colours on a patch of wall in his view of Delft, so Vermeer seems to have readily vacuumed up ideas from other painters. One of the things experts rely on when assessing signatures is whether they're integrated into the paint surface to ensure that they haven't been added by another hand. Because what I believe is a signature on the floor is overpainted, we won't know if it's integrated into the paint surface without cleaning off the overpaint. But the signature on the wall has a streak of damage that shows that there are no other colours. It's been painted at the same time as the wall in the same colours. So why are there 2 signatures? Well, another later painting of Vermeer's has two signatures on it as well, so it wouldn't be unique, but I think there are other possibilities. The signature on the wall is faint. It took years for me to see it, so he might have decided later to re-sign the painting on the floor, perhaps in the same place he had already dated it. And there's also the possibility that my little painting was worked on over many years, and when it was finally finished, he re-signed it. We'll explore that possibility in future episodes. Now that we have a signature that seems to fit better with the date, I want to revisit the issue of perspective. You'll recall in the last episode, de Hoogh seemed to have perspective pretty much under control, apart from the chair, while my painter was really freelancing in terms of the use of vanishing points. So the question I pose is, does it look like my painter was just emerging into the outside world for the first time and having to paint buildings which actually have vanishing points? I think so. While we're on perspective, it was interesting to note in the last episode that neither de Hoogh nor my artist got the chair correct. I wonder whether part of the scene was drawn from life and part was constructed in the studio. So although de Hoogh had a better command than my artist, he was also still learning. In case you're getting worried about how long this series is going on for, we're about halfway through the story, and I can assure you that the last few episodes will be well worth seeing. Just a teaser before I finish. One of the first three of Vermeer's paintings has something that is also in my painting. Can you guess what it is? In the next episode, I think we need to look at where this painting came from. Please subscribe if you haven't and give this video a like to help other people discover this story. As always, thanks very much for watching.